right, so you're ready to take your goat farming skills to the next level, right?
That's right.
And what are the biggest obstacles you're going to face? Well, it's those sneaky little trematode parasites.
Yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of research right here on the 3 biggest troublemakers, the ones you got to watch out for.
Exactly. The usual suspects.
Fasciola,
Yep.
Icrocoelium, and Paramphistomum.
Big words, I know.
But don't worry, we're going to break it all down, make it simple so you can spot them, treat them, and stop them from ever coming back, like a pro.
That's the goal. Healthy goats, happy farmer.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll have all the knowledge you need to keep your herd healthy and thriving, right?
Absolutely. And more importantly, profitable.
Because let's face it, these parasites, if you let them get out of control...
They can really eat into your profits.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
So let's start with the most notorious one, the one everybody's heard of, fasciola.
The liver fluke.
The liver fluke, yeah.
Yeah.
Causes fasciolosis. It's everywhere, worldwide problem.
That's a global issue, for
Yeah.
sure.
And unfortunately, goats, they're particularly vulnerable.
More so than cattle, actually.
More than cattle. Really? Why is that?
Well, goats, they lack some of the natural immunity that cattle have developed against Fasciola hepatica,
Ah, so they're just not as equipped to fight it off.
basically. Makes them easy targets.
Okay, so what makes this parasite so tough to deal with? I mean, the life cycle seems pretty complex.
Oh, it is. It all starts with the adult flukes, living it up in the bile duct of an infected goat. They lay thousands of eggs, which end up back on the pasture through the goat's droppings.
Right.
Those eggs hatch into Parasites, and here's where things get interesting. They need to find a specific type of snail to survive.
Snails. So even snails can cause problems for my goat.
I hate to break it to you, but yeah. The Parasites, they develop inside the snail in 2 cercaria, and then they're released back onto the pasture.
Oh boy.
Those cercaria then insist on vegetation, just waiting for a goat to come along and munch on them.
It's like a trap.
Pretty much. Once those metacercariae are eaten, they burrow through the gut wall and head straight for the liver, causing all sorts of damage along the way.
So it's not just about the adult flukes chilling in the liver.
Yep.
The journey these immature flukes take is a big part of the problem.
Exactly. That migration through the liver causes acute fasciolosis, leads to inflammation, and can even cause a deadly bacterial infection called black disease.
Black disease. That sounds scary.
It is. And once those immature flukes reach the bile duct and mature, that's when you get chronic fasciolosis.
And that causes
Anemia, weakness, and a condition called pipestem liver.
pipestem liver. What in the world is that?
Basically, the bile duct, which should be smooth and flexible, gets all thick and rigid, almost like a drinking straw.
Because of the flukes.
Yep, the constant irritation from those flukes. This blocks the flow of bile, makes the liver work even harder. It's a classic sign of chronic fasciolosis.
So let's say I walk into my barn and I see a goat that's lost weight, looking weak, maybe its gums are kind of pale. Those could be signs of a fasciola infection.
Absolutely, could be. And in really bad cases, you might see swelling under the jaw. That means there's fluid buildup from liver problems.
Okay, so those are some warning signs to look out for. But how do you know for sure if it's fasciola? I mean, you can't exactly give a goat an ultrasound out in the pasture, right?
No, you can't. But a good starting point is a fecal examination. We look for the fluke eggs under a microscope.
Are they easy to spot?
Yeah, they're fairly distinctive, kind of oval-shaped with a little lid on one end.
So those telltale eggs, that's our proof.
They can be, but remember, just because one fecal test comes back negative doesn't mean the goat's not infected. Flukes don't lay eggs constantly, so you might need to test a few times just to be sure.
Makes sense. So we've got the clinical signs, the fecal exam, anything else we can use to diagnose it?
Blood tests, like ELISA, can detect antibodies against fasciola. That can be really helpful, especially early on, before those eggs show up in the feces.
Good to know. Now, let's talk treatment. What's the best way to get rid of these flukes once they've taken hold?
Triclobendazole. That's the gold standard for treating fasciolosis. It works on both adult and immature flukes, which is important. Because remember, both stages cause damage.
So 1 dose and we're done.
Usually a single oral dose does the trick. But it's always best to talk to your vet, make sure you've got the right dosage and treatment plan for your goats. They might recommend more treatments or some supportive care. Depends how bad the infection is.
Okay, treatment seems pretty straightforward. But let's talk prevention. How do I keep fasciola out of my herd in the first place?
Snail control is key. Remember, those snails are essential for the parasite to complete its life cycle.
Right.
You can reduce snail populations through good pasture management, Keeping pastures well drained, avoiding overgrazing, even rotating pastures can help disrupt their habitat.
So those basic pasture management practices, the things we always talk about, they actually make a difference for parasite control.
Absolutely, they do. There are also chemical baits that target snails directly, but those should be used carefully because they can harm other animals.
Don't want to create a new problem while trying to solve this one? What about deworming? Does that help prevent fasciola?
Definitely. Using a good fluticide like triclobendazole or rifaximinide as part of your regular deworming program can really help prevent infections from taking hold.
So just like we deworm for roundworms, we need to make sure we're using something that targets flukes too.
Exactly. And remember, a multi-pronged approach is always best. Snail control, strategic deworming, good pasture management, all working together.
Okay, we've covered a lot on fasciola. Let's move on to our next trematode. Dicrocohelium dendriticum, also known as
The lancet.
the lancet fluke, right?
Not as widespread as fasciola, but still a concern, especially in hilly areas. And good news this time, goats are actually less susceptible to this one than sheep.
So, for once, the goats have an advantage.
Small victories, right?
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What makes the lancet fluke's life cycle so unique?
Okay, get ready for this because this one involves not one, but two intermediate hosts, land snails and ants.
Ants. Now, ants are involved. This is getting complicated.
It is pretty wild. It all starts, again, with adult flukes in the goat's bile duct, shedding eggs that end up being eaten by land snails. Inside the snail, the parasite develops, just like with fasciola. But then things get weird. The snail releases these larval flukes in slime balls, and ants love those slime balls.
Fly balls. Ew.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. But the ants eat them, and they ingest the parasite, which then encysts inside the ant. But here's the kicker. Those encysted flukes can actually manipulate the ant's behavior.
Seriously.
They make the ant climb to the top of blades of grass and cling on tight, which makes them easy pickings for grazing goats.
So the ant becomes a taxi service for the parasite, delivers it straight to its final destination.
Exactly. The goat eats the infected ant along with the grass, and boom! The parasite completes its life cycle back in the goat's liver.
Wow, that's incredible. But what happens once those lancet flukes are back in the goat? Do they cause the same kind of liver damage as fasciola?
Actually, no. Unlike fasciola, those immature lancet flukes, they don't migrate through the liver tissue. They head straight for the bile duct, so less liver damage overall.
Well, that's good news. But if they're not causing a ruckus in the liver, how do we even know if a goat's infected?
Well, a lot of the time, dicrocoliosis doesn't show any obvious symptoms. It's what we call subclinical.
So they could be infected, but not showing any signs.
Exactly. But in cases of heavy infestation, you might see things like anemia, fluid buildup, weight loss.
Okay, so those are things to watch out for.
Yeah.
But it sounds like diagnosis could be tricky.
Fecal examination is our go-to. Just like with fasciola, we look for those dicrocolium eggs under a microscope. They're smaller than fasciola eggs and have a slightly different shape.
And I'm guessing, just like with fasciola, one negative fecal test doesn't mean there's no infection.
You got it. Might need multiple tests to be sure, especially if you suspect an infection, even though the first test was negative.
Okay, so let's say we've diagnosed dicrocoliosis. What's the treatment? Are the same drugs used for fasciola effective against this one?
There's some overlap, but some drugs are better specifically for dicrocoelium. Albendazole, praziquantel, and triclabendazole are all good options. Oh, and also thiabendazole, fenbendazole, and netobimin. Your vet can help you choose the best one based on what's going on and what's available.
Okay, a few different options there. But what about prevention? Can we use the same strategies we use for fasciola to control dicrocolium?
Snail control is still important, but controlling ants, that's practically impossible. They're everywhere.
Right. So our main focus for prevention is?
Regular deworming with an effective fluticide.
Makes sense. If we can't get rid of the ant taxi service, we got to make sure the passengers don't survive the trip.
Exactly. Regular deworming combined with good pasture management to control those snail populations can really help keep dicrocolium at bay.
All right, we've tackled fasciola and dicrocolium. Ready to move on to the final trematode on our list.
Bring it on. Let's talk about paramphystomum. You might know it as the rumen fluke.
Rumen fluke. So this one's not hanging out in the liver like the other two.
Nope, this one prefers the rumen. They're particularly common in humid regions. And here's a twist. The adult rumen flukes, they're not actually as harmful as their immature counterparts.
Wait, the immature ones are the troublemakers. Why is that?
Because those young flukes attach to the small intestine and cause some serious inflammation. We call it enteritis. The adults, once they're in the rumen, they're pretty harmless.
So different kind of damage with this one. What exactly are those young flukes doing to the small intestine?
They burrow into the intestinal lining, causing inflammation, bleeding, you name it.
So if I'm a goat farmer, what should I be looking for? What are the signs of paramphystomyosis?
You'll likely see some pretty nasty diarrhea, loss of appetite, weight loss, maybe even anemia. The goat's just going to look miserable.
Okay, so pretty noticeable signs. That's helpful. What about diagnosis? Same old fecal exam?
Yep, fecal exam is our go-to. We look for those paramphystomum eggs. They're large, clear, and have that little lid we talked about earlier. But there's a catch. In acute cases, when those young flukes are causing all the trouble but haven't started laying eggs yet, the fecal exam might come back negative.
So you could have a goat that's really sick, but the test doesn't show it.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to look at the clinical signs, not just rely on the fecal exam. And sometimes you might even see the immature flukes themselves in the feces.
Okay, so gotta be extra careful with this one. Let's talk treatment. Do the same drugs that work for fasciola and dicrochelium work for rumen flukes?
Not quite. For adult rumen flukes, oxyclosinide is the way to go. Single oral dose, usually, and it's very effective.
And what about those young flukes causing all the trouble in the small intestine?
For those, we use niclosamide. It specifically targets those immature flukes.
So, 2 different drugs for 2 different stages. Makes sense. What about prevention? Any tips for keeping those rumen flukes away?
Snail control, once again, is critical. Remember, these parasites need snails to complete their life cycle. By controlling snail populations, you can significantly reduce the risk of paramphystomyosis. And of course, good pasture management, like drainage and rotational grazing, can help.
So same strategies as the other trematodes. Good to know.
Exactly. And early detection is key with paramphystomum. The sooner you catch it, the better the chances of successful treatment and preventing long-term damage to the small intestine.
Okay, so we've covered the life cycle, symptoms, diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of rumen flukes. Anything else goat farmers should know about this one?
Just remember those early signs, like diarrhea, can be subtle. Don't wait until the goat's really sick to do something. If you think something's wrong, call your vet.
Great advice. We've covered a lot today. But before we move on to other aspects of goat health, let's take a quick break and recap what we've learned about these trematode parasites.
So ready to dive into some other health challenges. Those are always fun.
Okay, perfect. Because we've talked a lot about flukes. But there's another group of parasites that can really cause problems for goats. And our research mentions them too. Tapeworms.
Ah, yes. Tapeworms. Specifically, we're talking about mononucleosis. That's a pretty common tapeworm infection you see in goats.
And when we say mononucleosis, what tapeworm are we really talking about?
The main culprit is Mononuclea expansa. And let me tell you, this tapeworm is a whopper. It can grow up to 10 meters long.
10 meters. Seriously. That's like longer than my truck. Okay, I'm kind of glad these guys live in the intestines and not out in the open.
Yeah, 10 meters is no joke. And their body structure is pretty interesting. They're made up of these segments called proglottids. Each segment has both male and female reproductive organs.
Wow, so they're like little self-contained units.
Exactly. And once a proglottid is packed with eggs, it detaches from the worm and gets passed out in the goat's poop.
Okay, so unlike those fluke eggs we were looking for under a microscope, you can actually see these tapeworm segments with the naked eye.
Oh, absolutely. Those gravid segments, as we call them, are easy to spot. They look like tiny grains of rice in the goat's droppings. It's a pretty clear sign of a Mononuclea infection.
Okay, so we've got these giant tapeworms living in the intestines, shedding segments full of eggs. What does that actually do to the goat? How sick do they get?
Well, the good news is that in adult goats, mononucleosis is usually pretty mild.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, you might see some diarrhea, maybe a little weight loss, or even a blockage in the intestines if there are a ton of worms. But it can be more serious in kids, you know, the younger goats. Could lead to bigger problems.
So, once again, the little ones are more vulnerable. What about the life cycle of this tapeworm? Does it need an intermediate host, like those flukes we were talking about?
Yes, it does. Mononuclea expansa needs orbated mites to complete its life cycle. You might know them as beetle mites.
So those tiny little mites are carrying tapeworm larvae? That just seems crazy to me. How does that even work?
Well, the adult tapeworm releases eggs into the goat's intestines, and then they get pooped out. The eggs are then eaten by orbated mites that are hanging out in the pasture. And inside the mite, the eggs develop into cysticercoids, which is the infective larval stage of the tapeworm.
So the mite accidentally eats these tapeworm eggs, and then the larvae grow inside the mite.
That's exactly right. And as the goat grazes, it might accidentally eat those infected mites. Then the cysticercoids are released in the goat's gut, they grow into adult tapeworms, and the whole cycle starts over again.
It really is amazing how these parasites have figured out these complex life cycles. But back to monesiasis. How do we diagnose it? You mentioned those visible segments, but are there any other signs to look for?
You're right. Those segments are a pretty good indicator, especially if you see a lot of them. Clinically, though, the signs can be pretty general, things like diarrhea or weight loss. But in kids, you might see more severe stuff like a swollen belly, weakness, and sometimes even neurological problems.
So those segments are really the most obvious sign. But to be sure, we need to do a fecal exam and look for eggs, right? Like we did with the flukes.
Exactly. Those segments are a strong clue, but we need to look for Manitzi eggs under a microscope to confirm. And these eggs are easy to spot. They've got this distinct triangular shape.
Triangular, huh? That is definitely different. Okay, let's say we figured out a goat has a Manitzi infection. What do we do about it? Are there drugs that will get rid of these tapeworms?
Luckily, yes. Several drugs are really effective against Manitzi expansa. Niclosamide, fenbendazole, and albendazole are all commonly used, but praziquantel is probably the most effective.
So there are options, and of course, it's always best to work with your vet to figure out the best treatment plan. But what about prevention? Is there any way to break the life cycle and stop these tapeworms from getting into our herds in the first place?
Well, controlling those oribated mites in the pasture would be great, but it's really difficult to do.
So, kind of like those ants we talked about with Dicrocodilium, controlling those mites isn't really realistic.
Exactly. So the main thing we focus on for prevention is regular deworming with a medication that targets tapeworms. If you use a broad-spectrum dewormer that gets those tapeworms, you can keep them from settling in and laying more eggs, which breaks the cycle.
So just like with the liver flukes, strategic deworming is super important. Anything else goat farmers should keep in mind?
Well, good pasture management is always important. Rotating pastures and making sure you don't overgraze can help keep those oribated mite populations down, which lowers the risk of infection.
So it all boils down to good management practices, right? Keeping things clean, rotating pastures, and having a good deworming plan. All those things can really protect your goats from these parasites.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of good management, you mentioned wanting to talk about other health challenges too, right? Not just parasites.
Yes, parasites are a big deal, but there's so much more to keeping goats healthy. Let's switch gears and talk about some general strategies for preventing problems before they even start.
Sounds like a plan. Let's talk holistic goat health.
Let's start with nutrition. What are the most important things goat farmers need to think about when it comes to feeding their herds?
The foundation of healthy goats is a good, balanced diet. They need high-quality forage, pasture, hay, or a mix of both.
So good roughage is essential. What about grain? Do all goats need that?
Not always. It depends on the goat's age, breed, and what you're using them for. Like a doe that's producing milk will need more energy and protein, so we might add grain to their diet.
Makes sense. So for most goats, a good forage-based diet is enough.
Exactly. But we also need to make sure they're getting enough minerals and vitamins.
Oh, right. So what's the best way to do that?
A mineral supplement. There are mixes specifically designed for goats that you can offer free choice so they can munch on it whenever they need to.
So just like with cattle, we need to give them a balanced mineral mix. And of course, we can't forget about water.
Of course not. Clean, fresh water is absolutely essential for any animal, including goats. Make sure their water source is clean and check it often to make sure it hasn't gotten contaminated.
So good quality forage, maybe some grain, a balanced mineral mix, and plenty of clean water. Anything else we need to think about when it comes to nutrition?
One more thing, we've got to watch out for anything toxic in their environment. Some plants can be poisonous to goats, so you definitely want to make sure your pastures are free of those.
That's a great point. We should probably do a whole deep dive on poisonous plants sometime. But for now, let's talk about housing. What are the must-haves for creating a safe and comfortable environment for goats?
Shelter is a big one. Goats need a dry, draft-free place to escape the weather. Whether it's hot, cold, rainy, snowy, they need a place to get out of the elements.
So a well-built barn or shed is a non-negotiable for any goat farmer. What about space? How much room do goats need?
Well, goats are social animals, so we need to give them enough room to move around and interact with each other. If they're too crowded, it can cause stress, diseases can spread more easily, and they could even get hurt.
So enough space both inside and outside. And what about bedding? What's best for goats?
Straw is a good choice, but you can also use wood shavings or other absorbent materials. The key is to keep it clean and dry so the goats are warm and comfy.
Okay, so shelter, space, and bedding. What else do we need to consider?
Ventilation. Goats produce a lot of ammonia in their pee, so good ventilation is super important. It helps prevent respiratory problems.
Right. A well-ventilated barn is a healthy barn.
Yep.
And we've covered nutrition and housing. What about healthcare in general? What are the essential things we need to do to keep goats healthy?
Regular checkups with the vet are really important. That way you can catch problems early. And of course, vaccines are crucial to protect goats from all sorts of diseases.
So vet visits and vaccines are a must. What about their hooves? I've heard those need special attention too.
You're right. Goat hooves need to be trimmed regularly to keep them from growing too long. Overgrown hooves can make them lame and cause other issues.
Okay, hoof trimming is on the list. Anything else?
Well, we can't forget about parasite control. We talked about the major parasites already, and a good deworming program and good pasture management are essential for keeping those under control.
Right, we've spent a lot of time on those parasites. But what about other diseases? Are there any specific ones that goat farmers should be aware of?
Oh, yeah. Goats can get a whole range of diseases, just like any other animal. Some common ones are respiratory infections, enterotoxemia, and something called pregnancy toxemia.
That's a lot to keep track of, so catching things early is really important, right?
Absolutely. You've got to know your goats really well and pay attention to any changes in their behavior or how they look.
So pay attention and call your vet if anything seems off. Any other general tips for keeping goats healthy?
If you're bringing in new goats, always quarantine them before letting them mix with your herd. That can help prevent the spread of diseases. And practice good biosecurity. Things like cleaning and disinfecting equipment can really minimize the risk of outbreaks.
That makes sense. So it's about creating a healthy environment, making sure they're getting the right nutrition, and being proactive about healthcare.
Exactly. And remember, every goat is different, so you need to adjust your management practices to fit the specific needs of your herd.
Okay, before we move on to some bigger picture strategies for success in goat farming, I want to talk about something else important. It's not directly related to parasites, but it's something that can really impact goat farmers. Abortion.
That's a great point. Abortion can be devastating, both emotionally and financially.
Exactly. So let's talk about what causes abortion in goats and how we can prevent it and manage it if it does happen.
Sounds good to me. But first, we need to acknowledge that often we don't actually know what causes a goat to abort. It can be really frustrating. We do our best to figure it out, but sometimes it remains a mystery.
So even with all the tests we have, we might not always know for sure.
It happens. We think that about half of all abortions are actually caused by infections. The other half are caused by all sorts of things, from stress to nutritional deficiencies to problems with the fetus itself.
Wow, that's a lot of possibilities. It makes you realize that preventing abortion isn't always easy. But for now, let's talk about those infections that can cause abortion. What are some of the most common ones?
Well, chlamydial abortion, sometimes called zoonotic abortion, is a big one. It's caused by a bacteria called Chlamydia abortus, and this one can spread through a herd pretty quickly.
So this is a contagious one that we really need to watch out for. What are the signs of chlamydial abortion?
Often, the only sign is the abortion itself. And it can happen at any stage of the pregnancy. Sometimes the doe will have other symptoms like fever, or she might be lethargic, or even have pneumonia, but not always.
So she could abort without any other warning signs. That makes it really hard to manage.
Yeah, unfortunately. You might not even know there's a problem until it's too late.
So how do you diagnose it?
You have to send samples to a lab, samples of the aborted fetus, the placenta, or vaginal swabs. The lab can run tests to see if Chlamydia abortus is present.
Okay, so we definitely need a vet involved. What about treatment? Can we cure it?
You can treat it, but it doesn't always work. Tetracyclines are the antibiotics we use, and they have to be given for a long time to get rid of the bacteria.
And what about preventing it? Is there a vaccine for chlamydial abortion?
There are vaccines, but they're not a foolproof solution. They can lower the number of abortions, but they don't always stop the infection completely.
So it's a tool in the toolbox, but not a guarantee. Anything else about chlamydial abortion that goat farmers need to know?
This is a big one. It can spread from animals to humans. Pregnant women are especially at risk, so you have to be super careful when handling anything from an abortion. Good hygiene is really important to stop it from spreading.
So biosecurity is key. Okay, what other infections can cause abortion in goats?
Another common one is toxoplasmosis. It's caused by a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, and cats are the main carriers.
Wait, cats? Those cute, cuddly things can cause problems for pregnant goats.
I know, it's hard to believe. But cats shed the parasite in their poop, which can get into the goat's food, water, or pasture. And once a goat is infected, it can pass the parasite to its kids during pregnancy, which can lead to abortion, stillbirths, or weak kids.
So we need to keep cats away from the goat's food and water. Got it. What are the signs of toxoplasmosis?
Just like with chlamydial abortion, the most obvious sign is usually the abortion. But some does might have a fever, act tired, or even have neurological problems.
So those signs aren't specific to toxoplasmosis.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like it could be hard to diagnose.
It can be tricky. Vets use a bunch of different tests, like blood tests, to look for antibodies against the parasite and examination of the fetus and placenta.
Okay, and is there treatment?
Unfortunately, treatment usually isn't very successful, especially if the doe has already aborted. Prevention is the key here, and that means minimizing contact with cat poop.
So, no cats in the barn, no cats near the feed. Are there any other things we can do to prevent toxoplasmosis?
Hygiene is really important. Keep those feeding areas clean and disinfected, dispose of anything from an abortion properly, and keep rodents and birds away from the goat feed because they can also spread the parasite.
Okay, good hygiene and biosecurity are really important. Are there any other infections we should be aware of?
Listeriosis is another one to keep on your radar. It's caused by a bacteria called Listeria monocytogenes, which is often found in soil, water, and silage. Goats can get infected when they eat or drink something that's contaminated. And then the bacteria can cross the placenta and infect the fetus, which can cause abortion, stillbirth, or weak kids.
So, another one to watch out for. What are the signs of listeriosis?
Abortion is often the first sign, and it usually happens later in the pregnancy. Sometimes the doe will have other symptoms like fever, or she might be lethargic, or even have neurological problems, but not always.
Okay, so those signs are pretty similar to the other infections we talked about. How do we diagnose listeriosis?
We have to send samples to the lab. The vet can take samples from the aborted fetus, the placenta, or even the doe's milk. They can try to grow the bacteria from those samples or use blood tests to look for antibodies.
And what about treatment?
Antibiotics can be used, but again, it's not always effective, especially if the abortion has already happened. Prevention is the best approach, and that means minimizing exposure to the bacteria. Make sure you're practicing good hygiene, storing and handling silage properly, and giving your goats clean water.
So those basic management practices we talked about are really important for preventing a lot of problems, including abortion.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that we've only talked about a few of the things that can cause abortion. There are lots more out there, and new ones are popping up all the time.
It sounds like we really need to be proactive about protecting our goats.
Yeah.
But what about the things that cause abortion that aren't infections? You mentioned those earlier.
Right. Those non-infectious causes can be just as important. Stress, for example, can mess with the hormones that are needed for pregnancy, which can lead to abortion.
So if a goat gets scared or something stressful happens, it could cause her to abort.
It's possible. And it doesn't have to be psychological stress. Physical stress, like extreme heat or cold, can contribute too.
So we need to make sure our pregnant does are comfortable and relaxed. What other non-infectious causes are there?
Not getting the right nutrition can be a problem too. If goats don't get enough of certain vitamins or minerals like vitamin A or selenium, it can affect the developing fetus and make abortion more likely.
Okay, so that balanced diet we were talking about is important for more than just overall health. What else?
Injuries can be a factor. If a goat falls or gets kicked by another goat, it can damage the uterus and lead to abortion.
So it's important to make sure those fences are in good shape and there's nothing dangerous in the barn. What about genetics? Can those cause abortion?
Sometimes. There are some genetic abnormalities that can cause the fetus to die, which leads to abortion. Those are usually rare, but it's something to think about if you keep having abortions in your herd.
So if you have recurring problems with abortion, it's worth talking to your vet and trying to figure out what's going on.
For sure. And remember, preventing problems is always better than trying to fix them later. Focus on those good management practices, keep stress to a minimum, provide a balanced diet, and work closely with your vet. All those things can really lower the risk of abortion in your herd.
Great advice. We've covered so much today, from those tiny parasites to the complex issue of abortion.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of information.
It has. But hopefully, our listeners are feeling more prepared to tackle these challenges and build healthy, successful herds. Okay, before we wrap up, Let's shift gears a bit and talk about some broader strategies for successful goat farming.
All right, so we've talked about a lot of the health challenges that goats can face, but there's a bigger picture here, right?
Definitely. Successful goat farming is about more than just dealing with problems as they come up. You've got to have a good overall strategy.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and talk about those big picture strategies.
Yeah.
Where do we even start?
Well, one of the most important things is observation. You really need to know your goats, like really know them, their personalities, what they like to do, even their little quirks.
So we're talking about being goat detectives.
Exactly. If you know your goats well, you'll be able to spot those subtle changes that could mean something's wrong.
Like what kinds of changes?
Oh, maybe a goat isn't eating as much as usual, or she's hanging back from the herd, or maybe she's got a slight limp that wasn't there before.
So those little things can actually be big red flags.
Exactly. They're clues that something might be off.
So it sounds like spending time with your goats, really observing them, is super important.
It is. And it's not just about managing their health, it's about building a relationship with them. You get to know their needs, their personalities.
That makes sense. So observation is key. What other strategies are important for success in goat farming?
Record keeping, for sure. Keep good records of everything. Health history, breeding dates, vaccinations, deworming treatments, all of it.
So we're talking about those notebooks and spreadsheets.
Yep. Might not be the most exciting part of goat farming, but it's important.
Why is that?
Because good records help you see patterns, catch problems early on, and make better decisions about how to manage your herd.
So it's about being organized and thinking ahead.
Exactly. Good records can help you prevent problems, improve your goat's productivity, and even save money in the long run.
Okay, observation and record keeping, check and check. What else?
Biosecurity is huge. You've got to keep diseases out of your herd. That means having a strict quarantine plan for any new goats you bring in, controlling who and what comes onto your farm, and making sure you're doing things like cleaning and disinfecting equipment regularly.
It's like you're trying to create a fortress to keep those diseases away.
That's a good way to think about it. A good biosecurity plan can really lower the risk of those disease outbreaks, and that protects your goats and your business.
Makes sense. Biosecurity, check. What about genetics? Does that play a role in successful goat farming?
Oh, absolutely. When you're choosing which goats to breed, think about the traits you want to see in their offspring. Things like disease resistance, good mothering instincts, and high milk production.
So genetics is part of a long-term strategy. You're thinking about improving the herd over time.
Exactly. It's about making those choices now that will benefit your herd for years to come.
Okay, so we've got observation, record keeping, biosecurity, and genetics. Anything else you'd add to that list?
One more thing. Never stop learning. The world of goat farming is always changing. New research comes out, new technologies, new ways of doing things. So keep up with those changes. It'll help you make the best decisions for your herd.
So read those books and articles, go to those workshops, talk to other goat farmers who have experience.
Yeah, all of that. And don't forget about networking. Connecting with other goat farmers can be really helpful.
Why is that?
Well, you can share experiences, get advice, maybe even find a mentor. You can learn a lot from each other. It creates a sense of community.
That's a great point. Goat farming doesn't have to be a solo mission. All right, so I think we've covered a ton of information today, from those little parasites to those big picture strategies for success. It's been a true deep dive into the world of goat farming.
It really has, and hopefully our listeners are walking away with some new knowledge and some new ideas for building healthy, productive herds.
The big takeaway here is this: knowledge is power. The more you know about goats, their health, their nutrition, how to manage them, and yes, even those pesky parasites, the better prepared you'll be. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and don't be afraid to reach out to your vet or other experienced goat farmers. They're a great resource.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of goat farming. We'll see you next time.